Hello everyone, I'm here once again, Uchendu Eugene Chibu, with you today. I would like to first and foremost thank everyone that subscribed to my previous video, and I would like to encourage you to do once again press down the subscription button. I appreciate that. Well, today's talk with you is more about women's land rights and gender. I would like to present to you a recent paper that I published. The title is Decolonizing Women's Land Rights, Gender and Land Ownership in Pre-colonial Africa. This paper, I wrote it based on kind of unstructured literature. You'll be wondering why. I think that's because, first and foremost, I'm a post-disciplinary researcher. What that means is that I don't put quite a lot of emphasis on disciplines. I basically think I do not have a structured discipline. I studied estate management within the frames or the interface of environmental science and engineering. I also studied business and management. I happen to be an MBA dropout, by the way, and then studied MSc land management, land tenure, and I finally did doctorate in engineering, where I looked at territorial development, which is within the interface of urban and rural planning and development, but more from the land management perspective. So with that said, you would imagine that I've walked through disciplines, hung around disciplines, and as a result, I tend to pick anything that is relevant from any discipline, in order to deliver my message and do my research. And that's the basis, or rather I would say the background on why I consider myself to be a post-disciplinary researcher. But many times, if you allow me to say that, I like to draw most of my methodologies from the social science, and yeah, you can call me a social scientist if you like. Now back to this particular paper. Now, if you've been able to read my work over the years, you will see that I've done quite a good chunk of work when it comes to gender and women, with a focus on women's land rights. And I try to, the best of my knowledge, do it from a scientific perspective rather than from an activist perspective. I've had reviewers sometimes accuse me of blaming the victim, and I kind of think it's because some of these reviewers sometimes are already fixated on what they expect from a paper. But I would basically say that I've also got a very good compliments, if you allow me to say that. I know that reviewers these days hardly do that, but yeah, I've got quite some compliments from feminist reviewers, and masculinist reviewers for my work in the women, men, gender area. So, but let's just break into it. So once again, the title is Decolonizing Women's Land Rights, Gender and Land Ownership in Pre-colonial Africa. This paper is published in Gender and Development, and you would see on the screen the actual document, and I hope that you would follow one of the links and access this particular paper. In terms of the background, the main reason I wrote this paper is because I believe, and from what I've seen in literature, gender and land ownership in Africa is notably uneven with respect to the coverage of women in the pre-colonial era. Now, what do I mean by decolonizing the gender and land ownership? Well, I'm not trying to assert or deny anything. What I've tried to do is basically put my lens on the pre-colonial period and try to understand the situation of women during that particular period. Well, the article has been written from the land administration perspective, and in terms of the chronology of timing, It regards the colonial period to be the period when colonial rules were formally declared. That is the period after the partition of Africa by the European empires at the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885. The period before the Berlin Conference of 1884-1885 is what I consider to be pre-colonial. And the period after 1960, when more than a third of all countries in Africa gained political independence, is what I consider to be post-colonial. So the paper, I have it here, is structured in 4 areas. The first part of the paper looks at the structure or levels of land ownership in pre-colonial Africa. Now, in this particular section, what I try to do is look at the philosophy of Ubuntu, which recognizes the supremacy of community, and then try to critique Ubuntu, that philosophy itself. And by doing that, I realized that the supremacy of community by Ubuntu, following the Ubuntu philosophy, gives us the impression that, that I am because we are. So, and that's what makes community superior. But this philosophy is usually rightly interpreted, to mean that the individual derives their identity from community. I'm not against this interpretation because obviously, from the customary perspective, community, it's supreme. However, while this is right, I still consider it to be one directional interpretation, because while the individual or subgroups in the community are not bigger than the whole, which is the community, they are important to the whole. So the individual cannot easily be separated from the community, because if there are no individuals, then there are no communities. It's community that gives, which is a group of people that gives address and turns space into place. Otherwise, it's just perhaps a forest. It's the human dimension of this interpretation that actually gives it identity. And as a result, individuals are what form community, and community is what gives authenticity to individuality. It's what gives it identity, heritage, and so on and so forth. What's my point? If I interpret this within the concept of, or rather the theory of, say, Van Bertalanffy's, general system theory, basically a part cannot be greater than a whole, but a whole cannot truly function without its parts. And when you consider this, then you realize that the community is only a whole because of its individual members and subgroups. When interpreted in the context of land ownership, then one can understand why there must have been individual land ownership or sub-ownership for a whole community, for a whole communal ownership to emerge. The point I'm trying to make is, when we speak about community ownership, there must have been individual ownership for community ownership to exist. And there must be community ownership for individual ownership to exist. If there is community ownership within the African context, if there's community ownership and then there's no individual ownership, then that makes you wonder what was added to reach the communal ownership. Individuals founded land, whether they were kings or queens or groups of households. People founded land and other people joined, and so ownership was always there from the individual to community. Now you might wonder if the community itself is superior, as the African basic philosophies have alluded and have pressed onto us, and which I really, really believe in. Then how can there be two kinds of ownership? Well, the Europeans would normally say there is ownership and then there is leasehold. My findings in this paper is, from my studies that led to this paper, is that that's not the African context. In Africa, there's ownership and ownership and ownership and sub-ownership. So even when the individual ownership is inferiorized as a consequence of the superiority of communal ownership, it doesn't lead to a leasehold. Rather, it is a sub-ownership, because in pre-colonial Africa, the individual ownership was beneath the community. However, it was not a leasehold, because that ownership held by individuals or subgroups who can be age groups or households was not limited to time. When the individual owns a property, a right to land or to natural resource, ownership by individual was not limited to time. If at all it was limited to time, it was limited to time based on natural causes. That is, the family or individual owned it and then the individual died. It would normally pass on to relatives. And at any point, there are no relatives to inherit or continue to grow that ownership, then the land, only then the land or that piece returns back to the communal pool. To not set in a confusion here, what I'm trying to say is there were ownerships and sub-ownerships. And those sub-ownerships in pre-colonial Africa were not equivalent to leasehold, because they were not subjected to time frame. And whenever a right was subjected to time frame, it is no longer ownership. It could be a grant or any other form, in any other form. So, having said that, I can tell you that there were three main ownership types: communal ownership, sub-ownerships that are not leaseholds, and non-sub-ownerships. The communal ownership is what we identify, or what they identified then when they said our land. Now, within this communal ownership, you have two other forms of ownerships: the sub-ownerships, which can be held by individuals or groups, and the communal non-sub-ownership, which is land held by community for future use, and that particular piece of land is not attributed to any individual or family. Whereas the sub-ownership, where individuals and households held rights to land, was subjected to other forms of less rights below ownership, such as grants. So individual and group sub-ownerships are those ownerships where individuals or families describe with the phrase "my land." And the main ownership is the one where we describe our land. Now, the idea of making this sub-ownership by individuals and groups a leasehold is erroneous, because that's a way of seeing ownership in Africa from a Eurocentric perspective. I can still own the land, and that ownership can still be inferior to the communal ownership without it being a leasehold. Now, leaseholds existed in terms of grants, whether they are long-term, short-term. So these are what I try to explain in this paper by looking at levels of ownership in pre-colonial Africa. I would encourage you to go and read this. You will get it clearer. In fact, I can tell you for one thing, I'm not very good at describing stuff orally. I'm better at trying to, write it down because it's much more structured for me and much more, I would say, more articulated. So please read the paper. When you read that part, you understand the levels of ownership within the pre-colonial Africa, in general, and at the same time, you would understand that there were individuals owned land. But then I need to give you evidence. If I found that individuals owned land and community owned land, then obviously there must be evidence of land markets in pre-colonial Africa, because you can't have ownership of different levels without having a market. So where there is ownership, there would likely be a land market. Likewise, where there is a land market, there are bound to be land transaction records. All these existed in pre-colonial Africa. The history of Nubian land tenure system now shows that the claim that there was no registration and private ownership in all of Africa is false. Emerging Nubian documentary evidence in the city of Ksar, Ibrim, has revealed the existence of land documents indicative of private land sales. There are also decrees about royal estates, estate management, as well as claims to ownership. For instance, there exists the leather scroll of an old Nubian in today's Sudan, by the way, where land sale from Ksar Ibrim, written in 1463 AD, on the sale of Ismaili land to Iangoka and Kassala for 129 gold pieces. I'm going to tell you about these evidences later, where I got them. This is from a scroll that shows that someone sold a piece of land, well, several pieces, however, it was measured for 129 gold pieces. There's evidence of private property in a place like Sokoto Empire, in today's Nigeria, by the way, comprising brief notes on land grants in Songhai, Borno, Futa Toro, and Futa Jalon in the empire. There's written evidence about sale of land which took place in Darfur, present-day Sudan, again, in 1840s. This recorded evidence showed that there was the right to buy and sell in some of the land grants, with examples made by the Jala family living in Shoba, who sold their land in the early 19th century in Darfur. When you read this paper, you get the references. There's also evidence of a folio from the 18th century land register at the church of Quisquam, founded by Empress Mentawab in today's Ethiopia. Empress Mentawab and other women owned land based on transactions outside the communal or customary regimes. Although these private ownerships appear to have observed among the high worth individuals, they were not discriminatory against women in that class. In fact, if there's anything anyone can observe from the literature, is that the discrimination was based on class system. The lower class and the lower class, both men and women, or middle class households, if such things ever existed, were not always part of these transactions. But at the upper level, they were transacting land, transferring land amongst themselves with offers and acceptance, as well as considerations and written agreements signed. And there's no evidence to show that women were discriminated in this sense. Instead, there is more evidence to show that women who happen to fall within that class bracket did it as men did, including the queens. I don't think I've been able to convince you all, but I would also say there is more to come. The point I'm trying to make is that women owned land in pre-colonial customary systems in Africa. there are 4 particular ways in which women have been identified to own land. You get the citations in my book, or rather in my article. Some women govern as sole rulers, queens. Do you really want to believe in your head that queens governed an entire city, an entire kingdom, and didn't own land? Of course they did. So one strategy was queens owned land and even had the right to allocate the land to both men and other women. There are other women who governed together with a king as queen mother, or sister to a king. And when they did this, they exercised land management roles that enabled them to own land outside the communal system. There were also arrangements in which the king mother, and king sister co-governed, owned, and allocated land to others, including men and women. There were also other arrangements in which an age set or group of elders govern their societies, enabling women within the set bracket or eldership to exercise direct or indirect power over land ownership. All these power structures allowed women to own land and to allocate it to other men and women. So when viewed from the pre-colonial sense, one can state that women owned land in pre-colonial Africa. The argument can be, it's not all women. Of course, it's not also all men. But women did own land. It is also well established that women had more say in land matters than earlier admitted or presented by Western scholars. For instance, the head women in Charewa and Makonde chiefship of Zimbabwe and the queen mothers of Asante in today's Ghana are key exceptions to the narrative that women were excluded from political authority. These women were the ones making the political decisions. So how could they not have owned land or at least controlled ownership over land? These women had their say in land and resource matters. Among the Swazi people in present-day Eswatini, women were the managers of the land. Each woman within a household had land allocated to them, which they managed for the household. And within the customary system, management is best delivered through assurance and security of ownership. I'm sure, I don't know if I'm convincing anyone, but you still need to read this paper. You can look at the screen and you get details of the paper and read it later. So, what's the point really? Does it really matter that women own land? After all, women are still, in the frame of today's tenure arrangements, marginalized. Well, the next point I want to make is that colonial land registration empowered men and disempowered women. So women are actually marginalized. But the point I'm trying to make here is, if we trace it backwards, you actually find out that the pre-colonial arrangement was more beneficial to women than the post-colonial arrangement. And here is why. First, there's a need to draw on European 18th, 19th century gender crisis or tradition to understand that the current African women's land rights situation was extrapolated from Eurocentric women dispossessive gender traditions. In this regard, the core land administration traditions have influenced African women's land right status, tilting their rights away from empowerment which existed in the pre-colonial era, of course, towards disempowerment in the post-colonial era. For instance, the introduction of official European-style land registers and the European-style titling and registration of ownership and land rights in the name of male heads of households was the problem. The Europeans introduced their system into Africa and wrote the laws that the registers which they introduced should, first and foremost, in terms of ownership, take on names of male heads of the household. These registers did not even give credit or respect to communal ownership. Imagine that. If the torrent system and the titling that it brought along and registration, and registers had allowed that communities should be registered as owners of the land, then women should have been part of the ownership because community comprised women, men, children, and all that. But that didn't do that. Rather, what they did was to bring the registrar and create a law that says that only the male heads of the family should be registered. So by doing that, they brought in a European style of ownership through registration that enabled and empowered the men in Africa and disempowered the women. But today we speak about co-registration. It's a big issue. We look at co-registration as, as a way to secure tenure for women. You wonder, why didn't these people talk about co-registration as at that time? The African governments are being blamed. But the guys who brought the registers dictated how the registration would be done and who would be registered. In most cases, it's the same guys telling us today to change it. I'm not against the change. I'm very much for it if you look through my works. So, what I'm trying to establish at this point is that those who brought the registers and put in the registration system empowered men, and that's not surprising because as at the time they introduced these systems in the 18th, 19th century, 17th century, depending on where in Africa, women themselves were not allowed to own land in Europe. In fact, women themselves were properties of men in Europe because the definition of a citizen in Europe then was a property owning man. Women had their struggles, so it would have been a little unbelievable for these very powerful European colonialists to have come to Africa when their women were not owning land, to walk into a country and meet communal systems where women had, some rights, or where women had the right and support it. What they did was to introduce the same system in their place in Africa, which was one that was beneficial to men. So, who do we blame here? Nobody. Nobody should be blamed. That's not the objective of what I'm saying. What I'm trying to say is that looking back, the foundation for women's suffering when it comes to land ownership in Africa was clearly set up and arranged through colonial structures. And if we understand that, perhaps we would know better how to dismantle, the problem. So colonial land registration exercises proved very disruptive to women's access to land rights in their communities in Africa. These disruptions either established or intensified the cornering of newly created bundles of land rights that emanated from shifting away from customary to statutory ownership or land use. Consequently, it widened the equality and equity gap between men and women's customary and statutory claims to land. This heightened women's struggles over natural resources, particularly land. This colonial exclusion of women from land registration as against the individual women's registration and co-registration or joint registration expanded the male-female land rights inequality, which women suffer today. Another common shortfall of conventional Eurocentric land registration system is not acknowledging that the land is owned by a community, of which women constitute a central part, enabling customary lands to be registered only by their exclusion from native communities in itself disempowered women as well. I have, in previous work on gender and women's land rights, tried to show that in Nigeria, women have not always been denied rights to land ownership. Queen Amina in Zaria was a warrior. She conquered lands, annexed them, and so she definitely owned land. The British colonial government's native authority legislations in southern part of Nigeria, when you go and check those legislations, they always bring this sort of phrase that says land should be registered by a male household, male head of the household, according to native customs. What I found in literature in pre-colonial isn't the native culture these native authority acts are talking about. So someone might, or someone definitely, dubiously rearranged the tenure system by inferiorizing what existed to inferiorize women's position in these tenure systems, and then authenticated this inferiorization of women's land rights through acts. And today, women are going around intimidating women when it comes to property rights and claiming that it is based on our culture because someone from Europe created a law that intimidated women and said that that law is based on our native culture. No. Too many liars going around. So, to put it differently, colonial Africa generally followed the same gender laws and traditions as European colonialist countries. In many colonialist countries of Europe, women's property rights were limited. They lived in either husband-controlled or father-controlled properties. Yes, in Europe, that was the situation of women during that particular century. It was the Married Women's Property Act in Britain of 1882 that actually granted married women in England and Wales the rights to own and control their own property. Check out the timeline, 1882. So the Europeans must have visited Africa and realized that women owned land rights in Africa and had to copy it, or at least take it as an example, because obviously women in Europe had already been agitating, for more secure land rights to own property. But when you look at the timeline, the Scramble for Africa, the Married Women's Property Act of Britain of 1882, they are close. And by that time, Europe had already spent more than 7 decades roaming around Africa and scrambling around to understand what was happening here. So they basically started giving to their own women what our women had in Africa, while at the same time denying our women what they already had. Let me just read to you the footnote I have on this. It's important. Still talking about the Married Women's Property Act of 1882. Prior to the 1880s, legal and social issues concerning married women's property rights in Europe had been an ongoing fight for women. To achieve a more empowering legal status for married women, multiple legislations were introduced and repealed in the British Parliament throughout 1870s, 1880, and 1881, leading to the enactment of the Married Women's Property Act of 1882. Although the Married Women's Property Act of 1882 became the turning point for women's empowerment through property rights in Europe, as other countries now had to learn from Britain, it still promoted impediments against married women to achieve equal property rights with their husbands. The Act prevented married women from gaining full contractual capacity of their separate property. All of this happened after European states had been in contact with several African states that had more advanced property rights systems for women. It was also a time when European colonial states were formally discussing the annexation of these African states under a policy of colonization, which was formally endorsed at the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885. Does that say something to you? 1884 to 1885, Berlin Conference to annex Africa, and then 1882, then giving women property rights. Somebody is copying somebody, and it didn't look to me like it's Africa copying Europe. Anyway, just to sort the whole thing out, what I've tried to do in this paper basically is to show you that we've got land rights and land ownership issues here in Africa, and women are at the bottom line of this whole discourse, and this needs to be improved. However, to do this, one needs to understand where we're coming from. Many a times, governments and patriarchy is blamed for this particular menace, and it's true. All I've tried to show you is how European patriarchy was exported into Africa or imported into Africa, whichever one you prefer. And when you understand this, in a male-controlled government, it's important to realize that trying to create some form of equality in male-female land rights, and we have to do that. The reason I say some form is not because I'm against it, please don't get me wrong. It's because obviously different countries have their own way of doing that. So, but while we try to do that, it's important that we understand that trying to equal, and balance the male-female ratio in land rights is not something new. It's actually where we started from. So why should it be a problem today? It shouldn't be. So I would like to end this by basically, first and foremost, I want to thank people who have influenced my work on this paper. Sometime in, I believe, July last year, July 2024, I was on a podium, a panel at the FAO in Rome, and I had the opportunity to speak to Sherry Dawes, Agnes Kusimbik, and Ruth Maizendik, who are notable, writers and scholars when it comes to women issues and land rights. And we had this discussion about, the African situation. And yeah, that discussion actually encouraged me to do this work. But the work itself was finally called up by Naja Dina, who invited me to, contribute to a special issue they were working on with the journal gender and development. And so I did this short paper. I know scholars would like to question methodology. It's simple. A lot has been written on this and I've cited them, so I use a very unstructured approach to my literature review. However, what is unique about it is that while doing the reviews, I realized that scholars in Africa have actually dug deep into these things. The only problem is that most of them are they're all hanging somewhere in the shelves of libraries in places like, University of Ibadan, Ahmad Bello University in Nigeria. At least I came across some of these, and various other universities across, the continent. These works have been done as PhD theses, and many a times they are not in the mainstream, mainstream publication circles, just because either the authors chose not to go into journal publication. So I would encourage all individuals watching this, all scholars in Africa, to do more in doing these investigations on the situation in Africa, because I believe and strongly do believe that this will benefit everyone. So it will not be unusual for some scholars, especially the core masculinist patriarchists, to brand this article of mine to be a colonization blaming piece. Even the feminists could do that. But I would like to set the record straight and clear. Colonial authorities in African countries did not promote a voluntary participation economy. No. These chaps from Europe were dictators. They didn't come to Africa to promote voluntary participation, where all individuals were enabled to decide when, whether, and under what conditions they could participate in land administration systems of their time. And considering this situation, it makes this article very essential for grasping what could have happened then, and also for us to have an open mind in addressing the women's land rights, knowing that equality for land rights is something that we all need. Okay, I would like to, just before I leave, to please beg you to not forget to subscribe, like, comment, and share the link to this video. Additionally, please press the bell button so that you'll be notified anytime I release a new video. Thank you.